Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko and all members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee on such an important matter. I'm Scott Whitaker. I'm the President and CEO of AdvaMed. It's the MedTech Association, and we represent 450 medical technology companies, from the smallest startups to the mid-sized companies to the largest global medical manufacturers as well, all of which serve patients in every healthcare setting with life-saving and life-enhancing medical technologies. Half of all medical devices produced every year in the United States are sterilized with ethylene oxide. That's approximately 20 billion devices. And we accomplish all of that while using less than half of 1% of all ethylene oxide used commercially in the United States. The list of critical, everyday medical equipment that relies solely on this sterilization method is long. Surgical kits with instruments such as scopes and clamps and scalpels and tubings and scalpers, all the tools necessary to conduct a surgery. Heart valves, pacemakers, respirators, IV sets, endoscopes, kidney dialysis instruments, continuous glucose monitors, and insulin infusion kits. All are sterilized with ethylene oxide and regulated by the FDA. The FDA has been clear that it's concerned about the availability of these 20 billion medical devices if the EPA's proposed rules are not done right. On March 15th, the FDA wrote, without ETO, there would be a significant sterilization shortfall with no commensurate sterilization alternative available, saying those shortfalls of a variety of critical medical devices would be imminent. These disruptions, they say, stemming from a lack of ETO, would have significant impacts on patient health, access, and critical medical devices. That's their quote. Safe ethylene oxide usage by commercial sterilizers has been regulated by the EPA for decades. We follow all federal and state requirements, and we've made it clear that we welcome updated regulations. After all, our industry's commitment to saving and improving lives does not end where sterilization begins. It bears repeating. We welcome updated rules. But it's absolutely critical that the regulations be done right. Sterilization is currently at capacity, and no new ETO sterilization facilities are currently under construction in the United States. Our industry is and has been working to develop new sterilization methods. However, they do not currently exist at the scale or the effectiveness of ETO, and FDA agrees. The reality is, according to a gap analysis of our industry, if EPA's proposed rules are finalized as written, the U.S. could face a 30 to 50% reduction in medical devices available to patients today. This would have a disastrous effect on patient care, because 95% of all surgical instruments are sterilized with ETO. Virtually every patient awaiting surgeries could be impacted. C-sections, heart valve repairs, open heart surgeries, hip replacements, knee replacements, brain surgeries, cancer biopsies, the list could go on and all could be disrupted. The FDA has been very clear, and we agree with the FDA. We simply cannot afford this risk. The EPA's mandate to protect the public is critical, which is why we've approached the EPA as partners, not as adversaries. For the rules to be updated in a way that continues to protect surrounding communities and ensures medical device availability, we're seeking a series of changes which we've outlined in our public comments to the EPA. We remain hopeful that the EPA will take them to heart. Finally, let me say in closing a quick word about PFAS as it relates to and will be discussed later today. It's hard to imagine the medical industry without many important products that contain fluoropolymers. CPAP machines, prosthetics, IV bags, surgical instruments, as I mentioned earlier, and many other medical technologies contain PFAS. These medical devices are critical to the treatment and the health of all Americans. Much like the regulations on ETO, it's essential that any regulation on PFAS takes into account the manufacturing and the availability of essential medical devices. When it comes to the regulatory process, congressional oversight is vital. Hearings such as this are important to make sure regulations meet their intent and do not harm the patients and the innovators who will be impacted by them. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for inviting me to testify on this critical, important public health issue.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker.
And that said, assuming that the EPA would not approve anything that causes harm, how does the delays in these approvals of the 88 chemicals that you guys have mentioned impact the economic well-being of lower and middle-income families? Are there any of those chemicals that could be applied to products that would be of benefit to people, whether it means reducing the cost of goods and services or potential new jobs? Mr. Whitaker?
Well, with respect to the medical industry and the medical devices that we manufacture, anything that slows down the process of getting products to market through new regulations that aren't in sync with the public health needs is going to cause problems for everyone, including people in low-income communities and those that don't have access to the healthcare system. So the answer is yes, which is why we urge EPA to work closely with us and move together toward a solution rather than something that's going to cause harm.
In that regard, and again, assuming that the EPA will not approve anything that would cause harm, is it possible that the delays in the approvals of these new chemicals could possibly deny somebody a life-saving pharmaceutical or a life-saving medical device or a life-improving, improving the quality of life? Is that possible?
Theoretically, it's possible. I would defer to Mr. John on the 88 chemicals, but I could say from our perspective, they go through the FDA to ensure that they're safe after the EPA has reviewed them as well.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, the vice chair of our subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
First, I want to thank Chairman Johnson for holding this hearing today, and thank for the witnesses for being here. Apologies for the delay. I am very concerned about the EPA's proposed ethylene oxide emissions and draft regulation decision, and I am not the only one. At an event on April 28th, FDA Commissioner Kaloff was asked about ethylene oxide rulemaking, and he responded, and I quote, "This issue is very much on the forefront for all of us. We are highly aware of it, and we are engaged in discussions." He concluded with, "I'm very worried." Those worries today are even more so. In college, I spent a summer in central supply in a sterilization unit of a community hospital. I can say with firsthand knowledge how critical adequate sterilizing procedures are in regarding procedures, surgeries, and ultimately regarding patient safety. This may sound hyperbolic, but restricting ethylene oxide can paralyze Americans' medical services because of the lack of an effective alternative to ensure appropriate, safe patient care. I'm a physician. Previously, I was responsible on a daily basis for 25 or 30 patients and their safety. Today, my responsibility is for the safety of 750,000 constituents. 750,000 constituents who rely on safely sterilized equipment for their medical procedures. Beside me is a poster, and you can see the differences to the naked eye in this poster that is beside me. There are glass syringes, some treated with gamma radiation, and the ones on top are treated with ethylene oxide. You see the clear difference, the clarity that remains with the ethylene oxide treated syringes, and how the gamma irradiation discolors those syringes. In contrast, it's stark. My first question is for you, Mr. Whitaker. Why is it essential that ethylene oxide is used for medical instruments and devices for tiny parts and the crevices that needs to be sterilized?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that question. There are about 40 to 50 million surgeries a year in the United States. So we're talking about millions and millions of instruments. And the reality is, if you don't do those safely with sterilized products, patients are going to be harmed by that. And the reality is today, and this is why Commissioner Kaloff was so concerned, there's not another sterilization product that gets to all the areas of the most intricate medical supplies as it is needed. And the result is that it's going to be the likelihood of poor execution on a surgery or infections that may come from that. So what you've outlined there is one great example, but there are plenty of others and other platforms as well that would be negatively affected by using the wrong sterilization method.
I think the clarity resonates by seeing the inability to maintain clear syringes, which will be used in a multiple of surgeries and procedures. Mr. Whitaker, AdvaMed has publicly stated that the EPA's proposals, as drafted, will result in an estimated total capacity reduction at sterilization facilities of approximately 30 to 50%, or even upwards of 70% in some facilities.
Right.
Paint me a picture, please, of what healthcare in America looks like if 50% of our nation's 20 billion manufactured medical devices cannot be adequately sterilized. How would that ultimately affect patient care?
A terrible effect on patients. It would bring surgeries and procedures, in some cases, to a screeching halt. You would have supply shortages in hospitals that we've never seen before, and it's real. This is not hyperbole. We're not just making this up. It's real. At the end of the day, the risk associated with executing this rule in its current form is a major risk to access and patient health, and at its core, that's why we're most concerned. Now, we've suggested FDA or to EPA a number of ways to make this palatable. We haven't yet to get an answer from them on that, but we remain hopeful that we can improve it.
Do you think we are on the cusp of a potential healthcare crisis, another one having just come through COVID?
Well, there's no question it would cause a crisis if the regulation goes into effect as it's currently drafted.
Mr. Whitaker, the proposed rules issued by the EPA earlier this year to implement additional regulations for sterilization facilities may result in facilities ceasing their operation and put a supply chain crisis here in the United States. It's an alarming EPA proposal that aims to change the processes for medical device sterilization. Do you believe the EPA has fully consulted with the FDA on the appropriate methods necessary to ensure medical devices are sterilized?
I would hope they have. I'm not sure that they have. Had they, I would suggest Commissioner Califf would not still be concerned. So if he's still concerned, I would suggest board consultation is required because we have to get this right.
Thank you for your clear answers. Your concern are our concerns on this committee as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
I mean, and ethylene oxide that the doctor was talking about, you were talking about, you said 40 to 50 million surgeries a year in the United States? Is that what we said?
Yeah,
Is that what you said,
between
Mr. Whitaker?
40 and 50 million surgeries, yeah.
Okay.
And 95% of the surgical instruments that are used are sterilized with ethylene oxide today.
Think about hamstringing that, what that would do to the medical industry.
Thank you for being here. But the EPA rules, if finalized, would require FDA to evaluate the sterilization process for a large number of medical devices to ensure that the devices are sterile. Given the quick compliance timelines, EPA seems to have underestimated the amount of time and resources that this would require. Mr. Whitaker, what timelines do you believe would provide the medical device industry with enough time to comply with FDA requirements for revalidating medical devices?
I'm not sure I can put a specific timeline on the industry more broadly because of the depth and breadth of the work we do, so it would depend on the product particularly, right? So, but I will say to go through that revalidation process and the reapproval process can take years to get done, right? And so if we're set back on products we're already producing and going through a revalidation process that could take years to complete, obviously the impact that has on the medical supply chain is tremendous.
Thank you very much. And I think it was Mr. Jan who wanted to say something. Do you want to add something?
I was just going to chime in and say
Follow-up.
that the administration is looking at 5 different chemistries that goes into automobile manufacturing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the chair, my colleagues, and also our witnesses here today. The chemical industry plays a significant role in the U.S. Supply chain, manufacturing supply chain. Nationwide, the chemical industry generates $639 billion in annual revenue, and the U.S. is the second largest global producer, producing 11% of the world's chemicals. Specifically, in my district in southeast Iowa, the chemical industry provides 2,250 direct jobs, generates an additional 5,480 jobs in plastics and rubber products, and pays $179 million in wages. The current regulatory environment of the Environmental Protection Agency would put thousands of jobs in my district. And when people sneer at that, Let me say that as a country, when we build wealth, we clean up our environment. Every nation that has created more wealth has had a cleaner functioning environment. And just exporting environmental risks to China or other countries does not absolve us of any responsibility towards cleaning the environment, a better environment, or better health for the people in the United States or the world. We had last month a hearing on the EPA's proposed particulate matter 2.5 standard that would decimate manufacturing in our state. Now we're looking at the EPA's concerning regulatory actions in the chemical industry that would ultimately lead to prohibiting the domestic manufacturing of chemicals. These chemicals are an essential everyday products we use today, including your cell phone, your car, your electronics, medical devices, as already been alluded. Specifically, the overregulation of ethylene oxide and formaldehyde would have significant impacts on our nation. The FDA estimates that 20 billion medical devices are sterilized using ethylene oxide. This includes surgical kits, IVs, anesthesia masks, heart valves, pacemakers. How many people would die from not having access to medical care because we don't have the devices that they need? These aren't just my concerns. In fact, the FDA stated in public comments to EPA that ethylene oxide may be the only method to date that effectively sterilizes and does not change the device during the sterilization process. I'm a former operating room nurse. I know all about sterilization and the sterilization methods that we have. The FDA went on to state without ethylene oxide, there would be significant sterilization shortfall with no commensurate sterilization alternative. Shortages stemming from a lack of ethylene oxide would have significant impacts on patient health and access to critical medical devices and patient care. How many people would die? How many people would die? Now, I'm also an ophthalmologist. And as you know, devices such as intraocular lenses used to treat cataracts in seniors and other populations is not only sterilized by ethylene oxide, it can only be sterilized with ethylene oxide given the delicate materials it's made of. How irresponsible is it to put forward a rule or regulation when there is no alternative to the sterilization method now? And absolutely we want to prevent cancers. Absolutely we want to clean the environment. But there is a risk to that, and what we're talking about is that risk and that benefit. So I understand that cataract surgery utilizing intraocular lenses is the most performed surgery in the United States today, with more than 8,000 surgeries per day. So what would be the impact on America's seniors if ethylene oxide were no longer produced in the United States? Mr. Whitaker?
It would be devastating. You mentioned intraocular lenses. That's one, and a very important one. It would essentially shut that down. But that's not limited to that type of surgery. It would be across the board for everyone in surgery. As I mentioned earlier, about 40 to 50 million surgeries a year. And the vast majority of products, 95% of products and surgical kits, are sterilized using ethylene oxide. I think the numbers speak for themselves. The hospital system could not operate with that level of impact, and it's not worth that risk. We're not opposed to a regulation. We think you can do it right, and we can work with the EPA to get there. But you have to be thoughtful, and you have to be science-based, and you have to be focused on the patients as well as the rule itself, and that's why it's so critical, and I thank you for raising it.
And I think both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, through the pandemic have realized that we need to diversify our supply chain from China. So in doing this, what would this mean for the capacity and supplies of critical medical technology needed for patient care?
Yeah, if the rule goes into effect as it is today, it would be very difficult from a supply chain standpoint as well. Shortages are almost certain to happen and happen quickly, and companies would have to relocate facilities overseas in order to sterilize at the level they need to. When you have to do that, then you have to ship product back into the country, and the supply chain challenges are more complicated.
Or maybe patients would have to go
Or
abroad
people would
for
go
their
elsewhere to
cancer
get them.
treatment?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back.